$65 billion. A Ponzi scheme that ran for at least 17 years, passed multiple regulatory investigations, run by a man who had once chaired the NASDAQ stock exchange. This is the largest Ponzi scheme in history, and the story of how a former chairman of one of America's largest stock exchanges quietly ran one from a floor of his own legitimate business, for nearly 2 decades. Bernard Madoff wasn't a fringe operator. He founded his investment firm in 1960, and by the 1990s, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities was a respected name on Wall Street, legitimate, profitable, and prestigious enough that Madoff served for a time as chairman of the NASDAQ stock exchange itself. Alongside that legitimate business, Madoff ran a separate investment advisory arm open mostly to wealthy individuals, charities, and institutions, promising steady, consistent returns, reportedly around 10 to 12% annually, year after year, with almost no volatility. In an industry where returns naturally go up and down, that consistency should have been the first warning sign. Madoff cultivated exclusivity as part of the pitch. Access to his fund wasn't openly marketed, it was often granted through personal introductions, word of mouth within tight-knit social and religious communities, and a carefully maintained sense that being allowed to invest was itself a privilege. That exclusivity did real work, turning ordinary due diligence, the kind any stranger might demand before handing over their savings, into something that would have felt almost rude to ask a trusted family friend or respected community figure. There was no actual trading strategy generating those returns. Madoff was running a classic Ponzi scheme. Money from new investors was used to pay returns to earlier investors, with no underlying investment activity actually taking place. As long as more money kept coming in than was being withdrawn, the fiction held. Client account statements, showing detailed trading activity and steady gains, were entirely fabricated, printed on outdated equipment specifically to make them look consistent with older filings, according to later investigations. Behind those statements, there was nothing. Here's the part that doesn't add up. A financial analyst named Harry Markopolos began raising detailed, mathematically specific warnings to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission as early as 1999, nearly a decade before the scheme finally collapsed. Markopolos calculated that Madoff's claimed returns were, statistically, close to impossible to achieve legitimately at that scale and consistency, and said so, repeatedly, in formal written submissions. The SEC investigated multiple times over the following years. Each time, examiners failed to uncover the fraud, in part, later reviews concluded, because investigators lacked the financial sophistication to properly evaluate what they were looking at, and in part because Madoff's reputation made investigators reluctant to assume the worst. Someone was paid to catch this. Multiple someones had years of specific warning, and still didn't. Madoff's client list read like a cross-section of wealthy America and beyond, charitable foundations, university endowments, Hollywood figures, European banks, and thousands of ordinary retirees who had trusted their life savings to a fund manager with an unimpeachable Wall Street reputation. Some charitable foundations were entirely wiped out overnight, forced to shut down completely once their invested funds turned out to be fictional. The damage wasn't abstract or limited to sophisticated institutional investors who could absorb the loss. A significant share of victims were individuals who had genuinely believed they were holding safe, conservative investments for retirement. Much of the money that reached Madoff didn't come to him directly. It flowed through so-called feeder funds, investment funds run by other managers who pooled client money and placed nearly all of it with Madoff, often collecting substantial management fees themselves for what amounted to simply handing money over and trusting his returns without independent verification. Some feeder fund managers later claimed they, too, were victims, unaware of the underlying fraud. Others faced lawsuits and settlements for what investigators characterized as willful blindness, a level of professional due diligence so minimal that it should have raised the same red flags Harry Markopolos had already raised in writing, years earlier. The scheme survived on new money continuously flowing in to pay off earlier investors' withdrawals. In 2008, the global financial crisis triggered a wave of investors across the market trying to withdraw funds simultaneously, and Madoff's operation, which depended entirely on new deposits outpacing withdrawals, simply ran out of road. By December 2008, Madoff could no longer meet redemption requests. According to later accounts, he confessed the entire scheme directly to his own sons, who worked at the legitimate side of the firm and, by most accounts, had no knowledge of the fraud. They reported him to federal authorities the next day. Physically, the fraud was hidden in plain sight. Madoff's legitimate market-making business operated on different floors of the same Manhattan building as his investment advisory arm. Employees on the legitimate floors had little to no visibility into what happened on the 17th floor, where the advisory business was run by a small, tightly controlled group. Even long-time Madoff employees elsewhere in the firm later said they had no idea what was actually happening just a few floors away, a physical separation that mirrored the informational one Madoff maintained everywhere else in the operation. Bernie Madoff was arrested on December 11, 2008. He pleaded guilty in March 2009 to 11 federal felony counts, including securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, and money laundering. At his sentencing, he acknowledged running what he called a giant Ponzi scheme, estimated to have cost investors roughly $65 billion in claimed account value, though actual out-of-pocket losses, money genuinely invested, as opposed to fictional paper gains, totaled closer to $20 billion. He was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison, effectively the maximum available, and died in prison in 2021. A court-appointed trustee spent years tracking down and recovering assets, ultimately returning well over $14 billion to victims, a recovery rate far higher than most Ponzi schemes ever achieve, though thousands of investors still absorbed permanent, life-altering losses. Madoff's son Mark died by suicide in 2010, on the second anniversary of his father's arrest. His other son, Andrew, died of cancer in 2014. The SEC faced sustained public criticism and internal review over its repeated failure to act on Markopolos' warnings, prompting reforms to how the agency evaluates and escalates fraud complaints from outside whistleblowers. J.P. Morgan Chase, which had served as Madoff's primary bank for decades and had internally flagged suspicious activity related to his accounts without escalating those concerns to regulators, later agreed to pay over $2 billion in fines and settlements for its role in enabling the scheme to continue. The case remains, even now, the standard reference point whenever regulators or journalists discuss the limits of investor due diligence, a reminder that a fraud doesn't need to be technically sophisticated if the people positioned to catch it simply choose not to look closely enough. Ruth Madoff, Bernie's wife, was never criminally charged despite decades of marriage and financial entanglement with the firm, though she surrendered the vast majority of her personal assets as part of settlements with victims and prosecutors. Several longtime Madoff employees who worked directly on the 17th floor were later convicted of knowingly assisting the fraud, including falsifying the trading records that made the scheme's paperwork appear legitimate for years. Madoff's scheme wasn't sophisticated in the way people often assume. There was no complex financial instrument, no clever accounting trick nobody could parse. It worked because consistent, suspiciously smooth returns were treated as a sign of skill rather than a warning sign, and because the reputation of the man running it substituted, for years, for anyone actually checking the math. There's a specific lesson in how Ponzi schemes actually end. They don't collapse because the math finally gets checked. They collapse when withdrawals outpace new deposits, meaning a scheme can be mathematically doomed to fail from its very first year and still run successfully for a decade or more, as long as enough new money keeps arriving. Madoff's scheme wasn't unusually clever in its structure. It was unusually large, unusually long-running, and unusually well protected by the reputation of the man running it. The numbers always tell the story eventually. In this case, one person had already told it, in writing, 9 years before anyone acted. Harry Markopolos warned the SEC in writing, with math attached, nearly a decade before Madoff confessed. If you want to understand why nobody listened, subscribe.